Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeremy Rogers, the General Counsel and Director of Legal and Government Affairs here at Oregon Realtors, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I'll be the moderator for the day, and our panelists are Rick Harris and Ashley Fordham, and I'm going to kick it over to Ashley here in a minute to really kick things off, but I first wanted to just start with some housekeeping items today. So first off, to receive CE credit, you must be watching the webinar from your own device. If you're watching in a group, only the person who logged in will receive the CE credit. You must also remain for the full duration of the class. CE certificates will be available by March 29th. Watch for an email from Oregon Realtors to access your CE certificate. This webinar will be recorded, and we will get the recording out to everyone as soon as possible. We're aiming for Friday to be included in our Legal Weekly newsletter. The chat has been disabled, so please use the Q&A function if you have questions. And before I hand it over to Ashley, because we're going to be talking today about the resolution of antitrust lawsuits and commission issues, I want to read to you our Oregon Realtors commitment to antitrust policy that will govern the conduct of our meeting today. So give me 1 second here to pull this up. All right. Oregon Realtors is a not-for-profit trade association devoted to improving business conditions of the real estate industry. Oregon Realtors meetings and events often include real estate professionals and other industry stakeholders who compete with each other or work for competing businesses. Oregon Realtors is committed to conducting all meetings and events in a professional, ethical, and lawful manner, including in adherence to all antitrust laws. To that end, the topics of this meeting will focus on advancing the interests of real estate professionals and consumers of real estate services, increasing competition, reducing risk for all parties involved in real estate transactions, and sharing insights on business best practices. The following discussion topics are prohibited: fixing, controlling, recommending, or suggesting the commission or fees charged for real estate brokerage services; fixing, controlling, recommending, or suggesting the cooperative compensation offered by listing brokers to potential cooperating brokers; disparagement of competitors; limiting product or service offerings; allocating geographical territory or customers; or refusing to deal with any market participants. Any discussion that's inconsistent with this policy will not be tolerated. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Ashley Fordham.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone. I am Ashley Fordham. I am your 2024 Oregon Realtors President. And as we gather here today, I am acutely aware that we really stand on the brink of a very profound change in our industry. And there, of course, are many factors that are stirring up uncertainty and fear. And I'm sure that many of you feel a sense of bewilderment in this particular season. So while change can be daunting, especially when it threatens the very foundation of our business, leaving us wondering how to navigate these uncharted waters ahead. But really, this turbulence in the midst of it, I would urge you all to remember one crucial thing, and that really is to stay calm and to get the facts. In times like these, when the ground beneath us really does feel shaky and the path forward is very unclear, it's easy to succumb to panic. And we all know that panic serves us absolutely no purpose. So instead, let us approach this moment with clarity and resolve and with a commitment to face the challenges head on. I would say now more than ever, it's really imperative that we rely on facts and true understanding of the solutions while maintaining a steadfast determination to work the problem. So let's not allow ourselves to be swept away by the news media, social platforms that can often drive our fear, but instead, we have a season to roll up our sleeves and dig deep into the data and chart a course forward based on knowledge, reason, and sound judgment. So I'm excited to have this discussion with you all today and to offer you some clarity. Before I dive into just an outline of our discussion today, I do want to highlight Jeremy Rogers, who is our head legal counsel at Oregon Realtors, and a very wonderful, amazing friend of mine, Rick Harris, who is a incredibly well-versed, seasoned veteran in our industry and an incredible trainer. So between the three of us today, we're going to offer you a layout of this session that I think will be very helpful to the navigation of your business practices and give you some clarity about what you can expect. So first and foremost, we're going to have Jeremy talk to us a little bit about a high-level overview of the settlement agreement and discuss the impacts and issues, and to discuss what OR has been doing for you and will continue to do for you. And then Rick and I are both practicing real estate brokers in the trenches, and we will provide you with the working perspective on what brokers and agents can be doing to prepare for these changes. And I would ask finally that you type any questions into our question and answer platform on Zoom, and we'll get to them after the main part of the presentation when we can begin to provide context. So we'll get through all of the things that we want to discuss, and then we'll circle back with your questions and make sure that you're well versed. So Jeremy, I will pass it over to you and give you the opportunity to just kind of highlight what we are looking at in these settlement agreements, and then we can take it from there.
Great. Thanks so much, Ashley. Well, and I want to start by saying that, it's really going to take all of us together, brokerages, agents, NAR, state and local realtor associations, and MLSs, working together to understand these issues and to move forward so that our clients can get the valuable and desired services that they want in the face of a changing environment. And we absolutely can do this. And I think that hopefully what you'll walk away with today is understanding that while these changes, some of which are significant, they're all things that we can work with, that we can thrive with, and that honestly, I think a lot of us were already thinking about and preparing for as we sort of had been seeing the NAR litigation unfold over the last few years, and certainly since the verdict came down in October. And also things that Oregon Realtors has already been creating tools to assist you with in getting ready for. So there's some additional things that came out of the settlement, and we'll talk about those today. But many of them actually are things that we've already created tools to assist you with in navigating. And we'll talk about those today and where you can find those. And we want you to know that we're here for you. This is, a webinar less than a week out after the settlement was reached, but we are going to continue to provide you with video, live training content, with handouts that you can use for your clients, that brokerages can use with their brokers. We've got a wonderful website, it's OregonRealtors.org/BBA, OregonRealtors.org/BBA, where we're keeping as a hub for all of our tools related to helping you navigate the issues that we're talking about today, including compensation conversations with your clients, using buyer representation agreements, and other related issues. So just wanted you to know that we're in this together, and your state association is here to help you navigate this. So let me just do a bit of contextualizing here related to the settlement agreement. So there's a lot of people on this webinar, and I don't know what level of background everyone has on the overall NAR litigation landscape. So I will start by just providing a super high level overview sort of what got us to this point of this settlement. So the settlement relates to the lawsuits that were brought by sellers claiming that NAR rules that require listing agents to communicate offers of compensation to buyers agents in MLSs, that those rules were anti-competitive and that they led to the stabilization of commission prices in the industry. As most of you know, NAR lost a major class action lawsuit back in October called the Sitzer-Burnett lawsuit related to this issue. The damages in that lawsuit were at least $1.7 billion and could have been as high as $5 billion. So that was a very significant loss. NAR had, it declared its intent to appeal, but appeals would have taken years. Appeals would have first gone to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, and then, depending on the outcome, could have gone all the way to the Supreme Court. Could have been 5 years until that was all resolved. Had NAR ultimately lost on appeal, that could have put NAR in a position of having to file bankruptcy. Even coming up with the resources to appeal, the bond that would have been required would have been a significant amount of money in the hundreds of millions or into the billions of dollars. So this is a real serious issue, and a lot of serious issues for NAR to consider as it was entering these settlement negotiations. There also, of course, was copycat lawsuits. So I know today, I think it's the first day of March Madness, the basketball tournament. Hopefully folks are excited for that. It started to feel like March Madness of copycat lawsuits. There was a lot of, this v. this in the West and the East and the South, all over the place. There was probably 24 copycat lawsuits that had been filed. And even had NAR appealed the Sitzer-Burnett verdict, it would not have resolved the issues in those copycat suits. So those copycat suits were brought against local and state realtor associations, local MLSs, local brokerages, sometimes even teams and individual brokers were named in them. And those defendants would have had to put up a defense, pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, potentially millions of dollars in legal fees over the years as NAR was still on appeal. And so it wouldn't have really NAR's appeals wouldn't have made those go away. So there was a lot at stake here going into the decision making for NAR in terms of the value of coming to a settlement agreement. So let's talk a little bit more now about the settlement agreement. So the settlement's not finalized. It must be approved by the courts. But we do have a really good outline from the settlement agreement. Assuming there are no changes to it, it would be approved by the court and then adopted through rules that NAR implements. We're going to talk about those key practice changes that NAR agreed to in the settlement, but ultimately we need to keep in mind that our conduct as realtors would be governed by the actual rules adopted by NAR. And until the court approves the settlement, and NAR adopts those rules, we don't have the exact language under which we'll govern, but we really do have a pretty good idea of what we're heading into here. For the purposes of our conversation today, I think some of the most important things for you to understand are, one, what the settlement accomplishes in terms of the release of liability. Because as I mentioned, all of those copycat lawsuits that were bringing these same claims from sellers about rules around cooperative compensation being anti-competitive, NAR settlement releases NAR, local associations, realtor-owned MLSs, and realtor members from liability in all of those lawsuits. So that is a huge win for our industry. As I mentioned, the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in legal fees that could have been paid in all these copycat lawsuits. And even if you win an antitrust suit, you still have to pay your own attorneys. So that was a significant burden that was really unclear how a local association or local MLS was really going to even be in a position to defend itself against some of these lawsuits. Now, NAR's release covers all of the NAR members other than agents affiliated with Home Services of America and its related companies, because Home Services of America is still a defendant in the Sitzer-Burnett case, and they were not part of this settlement negotiation. So they'll not to say that Home Service of America wouldn't reach a separate settlement in the future. That's up to them and the plaintiffs, but they're not part of this settlement. Okay. Now there's some other details. I won't get into the weeds in terms of brokerage level liability, not individual realtor level liability. There are some nuances. Brokerages that did more than $2 billion in sales are not automatically included in this. They would have to opt in and contribute some resources to the settlement fund. And non-realtor MLSs are not automatically part of it, but they can opt in by also making a contribution of funds and also agreeing to the same practice changes that have been agreed to in the NAR settlement and that we'll talk about today. So that's the release of liability piece, and that's a really important part of this. I think NAR was hearing from a lot of local associations and brokerages and MLSs about hey, what are we supposed to do here? We're now facing all these copycat lawsuits as a result of Sitzer-Burnett, and this was an effort to help resolve that. The other thing is, in exchange for that release of liability, NAR will be required to pay $418 million over 4 years. Okay, I'm not going to really talk about the details of that, other than it'll be over 4 years. It's spread out. But the big thing we want to talk about today are the practice changes that NAR agreed to. As I mentioned, those will ultimately need to be approved by the court and then memorialized in NAR rules. But they are laid out in pretty good detail in the settlement agreement, and that's what we want to talk about now. So really, we can summarize the practice changes in two buckets. Okay, one bucket is removing offers of compensation from the MLS, and the second bucket is requiring written agreements with buyers. Okay, there's a lot more detail than that. We'll talk about that here next, but really at a high level, that's what I want you to remember. Offers of compensation off the MLS have to use written agreements with buyers. So let's get down in the weeds a little bit more about that. So NAR will be required to get rid of any rules or requirements that listing brokers make unilateral offers of compensation to buyer's agents. Okay, so any rules that touch on that would need to be eliminated. MLSs will no longer be a vehicle to communicate any offers of compensation. Communicating such offers of compensation in the MLS in any form will be prohibited. Offer of compensation field will be removed from the MLS, and you can't use the remarks fields to do that either. Okay. Sellers will be allowed to communicate in the MLS how much they are willing to offer in buyer concessions. Okay, but they cannot condition that offer of concessions on the concessions being used to pay for a buyer broker. Okay, so it's a general willingness to offer the buyer concessions to be used as the buyer determines. Off MLS offers of compensation will not be prohibited. Okay, the listing agent will still be allowed to compensate a buyer's agent if they choose, so long as they are doing so at the direction of their client. This means that any offers of compensation from seller or listing broker must be communicated to buyer agents directly on a listing by listing basis, not through the MLS. Offers of compensation are not prohibited on a brokerage's website, but only with respect to the listings for that particular brokerage. Okay, so a brokerage can't include offers of compensation for listings that are not from its own brokerage. Agents can't sort MLS listings based on compensation offered. So even though the compensation is not communicated through the MLS, if the agent learns about compensation from some other way, they cannot sort the MLS listings to their client based on the offer of compensation. Okay. So there's a few other things, but those are the high level points related to the offers of compensation piece. And then I want to move on to the written buyer agreements piece. Okay. Well, and actually the last thing I will say, and of course, this is something that you all do already, but of course, if there is an offer of compensation, of course, not now, it will not now be communicated through the MLS, but if there's any offer of compensation, that of course needs to be developed and agreed upon in advance with the client. Written buyer agreements. Okay, so this is the other big piece of the practice changes. Buyer agents will not be able to show property to a buyer without having a written agreement with the buyer in place. Okay, now I want to emphasize what the language of the settlement agreement says. It says a written agreement with the buyer in place. Again, until NAR writes the actual rules, it's difficult to know exactly what's going to be required. But a written agreement doesn't necessarily mean a written agency agreement. Okay, so I've heard a lot of questions. Well, what about an open house? And do I have to have someone sign an agreement before I even show them around an open house? There are ways you can have a written agreement with a client that's not an agreement to represent them as an agent, but you're still putting down in writing what the relationship is. Okay, so for example, we at the Oregon Realtors have a form for a non-agency agreement. It's a written agreement. It lets the party know that I'm not your agent. You could have an agreement to say, I'm going to show you this one house, or just going to do this today, and then we can revisit about whether or not we want to enter into a longer term agreement. Okay, so I don't want people to freak out thinking that to even show a property at an open house, you have to sign a client up for a 6-month buyer representation agreement. That's not the case. However, until NAR writes the rules, we don't know exactly what will be required. Okay. The other piece of it on the buyer representation side is if you are entering an agreement that for a transaction where you will be compensated, regardless of whether you're expecting the buyer to pay you or expecting cooperative compensation, any type of compensation, the written agreement with the buyer must conspicuously describe the amount or rate of compensation and how it will be determined. Okay, and it must be objectively ascertainable. So you cannot say, buyer, you have to pay me whatever the seller will pay. Okay, you actually have to set a fee with your client for your services. Can be hourly, can be fixed price, can be commission, whatever you and your client decide, but it has to be particular. If the seller or the listing agent ends up paying it through either cooperative compensation or through seller concessions, great. That's great for them, great for your buyer, but the agreement itself actually has to set your rate of compensation with the buyer, and it has to be ascertainable. Good news here in Oregon is that we are already ahead of the game. So we actually, through leadership of Oregon Realtors and working closely with our realtor members of the legislature, Representative Brees Iverson, Senator Meek, as well as other key legislators who helped co-sponsor the bill, including Senator Anderson, we passed House Bill 4058 in the legislature. It was signed by the governor, and this requires the use of buyer representation agreements beginning January 1st, 2025. The NAR settlement, and again, it's not finalized, but the prediction is that the NAR settlement terms will be in effect and in rule by NAR by mid-July. Okay, so that would both be the cooperative compensation rules and the buyer representation agreement rules. So on this buyer representation agreement piece, it's really just moving up what already was going to become Oregon law by about 6 months. But the good news is, Oregon law is already passed and it applies to everyone. It applies to you, whether you're a realtor member or not a realtor member. It's about real estate licensees. And so everyone will be on the same playing field with respect to buyer representation agreements. The other thing that we've already done here in Oregon is launch updates to our forms at Oregon Realtors that make it easy for a buyer to request seller concessions to assist that buyer in paying for a buyer's agent fee. So when a buyer does have a buyer representation agreement and it sets the fee, and the buyer says, buyer's agent, I think you're doing a great job and you deserve to be paid, and I'm agreeing to pay you, but I'd really prefer if the seller would pick this up. We've put the tools in our sale agreement and in an addendum that goes along with it to allow your buyer to easily make that request of the seller, okay, in our sale agreement and our form 2.24 that goes along with it. Last month, we also launched a new handout for consumers that explains to consumers the concepts of cooperative compensation and buyer representation agreements. Okay, it describes what cooperative compensation is, why a seller may or may not want to work with their agent to offer it. Describes what a buyer representation agreement is, why a buyer would want to enter into one, and the tools available to a buyer to still get assistance from the listing side of the seller to pay for that buyer agent fee should the buyer prefer to pursue that. And so that handout for consumers is on that website I mentioned, OregonRealtors.org/BBA. Now, of course, that handout was designed for a world in which cooperative compensation is allowed to be offered on the MLS, but presuming that sometimes it wouldn't be. And so we created that tool. After July, cooperative compensation won't even be allowed to be offered on the MLS, in which case we'll make further updates to that handout to help explain all of that to your clients. And finally, I want to reiterate that hub, OregonRealtors.org/BBA. It's got not just this handout, it's got the forms I mentioned, it's got videos, all the videos and trainings we've done on how to use a buyer representation agreement, how to talk to your clients about commissions. Great resource. Please take advantage of it. And we're committed to continuing to update that as more details unfold and as we get closer to July. So with that, I'll end my piece and I'll hand it over to Rick and Ashley if they have anything they want to say before we jump into questions for them.
So Rick, really quickly, I would love for you to just summarize the practicality of what Jeremy just said.
Thank you, Ashley. Thanks everybody for being on today. I see that we've got about 44 questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask Jeremy a couple of those in a minute. But what I wanted to remind us of is what's really being asked here. The claim that lawsuits made is that we were not being competitive. We were colluding. And you can agree or disagree. I happen to disagree. But the bottom line about that is it means in practice that we have to continue to be competitive. One of the questions that came up in the chat is, isn't even having this discussion among competitors a form of collusion? And the short answer is no. This is educational. What does the lawsuit mean? And any recommendations about how I practice or about how Ashley practice are simply information that you can get to, not requests or recommendations about what you should do. Each brokerage is going to have to work through some of these issues individually. But for me, what is that as an opportunity? It's an opportunity for us to step up. It's an opportunity for us to prove our value. It's an opportunity for us to actually, on the buy side, determine exactly what we're worth and what we should be paid, and stop allowing a listing broker and a listing seller to say what we're worth. We get that opportunity to define it for ourselves. And it will take retraining. It will take retooling. The bottom line about all of that is, if we look at this as a reason to say no, a reason not to compete, it's like having a door. The door is open, but as long as we just look through the door instead of walking through the opportunity given, it's nothing more than a window. And it's a window to the industry that left us behind. My thought is here that we take this as the opportunity that it presents, how to demonstrate our value, how to have a written, defined relationship with both of our clients, with a seller client, with a buyer client, how to demonstrate what we're worth. And quite frankly, for all of us, how to pump up our game, because we've got to do that. That's the demand. That's the demand in every competitive environment. Now, a couple of things as well that came out of chat I want to kind of get to. There was a question about the expiration of this. Is it 12 years? It's actually 7 years. But my advice to you is not to get along for 7 years and go back. We're never going back. We're going to have a new paradigm. We will talk about ways to think about this discussion so you can understand how to help your clients work. But it's also an opportunity, brokers, for you to define within your companies what the expectations are, what the expectation for forms, what the expectation for relationship, etc. And I've heard this many times. This sounds like NAR is protecting itself. NAR is us. The National Association of Realtors is 1.5 million realtor members. There is no NAR without all of us. And so the interesting part that Jeremy pointed out is that as brokerages, agents, associations, MLSs, we got a way to get to a general release from these kinds of claims. And did we cover everybody? No. Are there people who are unhappy about it? Yes. Is there a pathway for each and every person, large and small, broker-owned or realtor-owned MLS? Yes, there is. That's part of what was carefully negotiated. Now, as we work our way through, materials that might be out of date are going to be down. There was a webinar that I did with Jeff Wyron, and that's been taken down, not because it's not a good tool, but because it's out of date. And so it needs to be updated before it can be out there. It's also important for us to think about, as we move forward, while this is settling lawsuits on the seller claims, there are still 4 lawsuits out that are based on buyer claims. Those were not covered in this settlement agreement, but the activities that we're taking is likely to help us with those. And there's been no trial there. There's been no settlement there. There's been no award offered there. So that is an ongoing issue for us to work on, but recognize what we're doing. We are getting right into the relationship with buyers and defining it, disclosing it, having written agreements for it that make it easier for us to understand our work and deliver on our promise of professional service. So really important as we work through that we think about those kinds of issues. And some of the questions that are in the chat are specific for how I ought to negotiate this or that. We just cannot do that. But what we can say is that this, in terms of stepping up, there are certain kinds of training that will help you with it. How to be a buyer representative, how to be a better seller representative, how to be a stronger negotiator. And certainly when we think about how the impact of our professional service fees work within the pricing of a home, how properly to understand how to price, how to define that price. And so classes like accredited buyer representation, seller representation specialist, real estate negotiation expert, pricing strategy advisor, all of those courses are things that will help you. And so as we work our way through, we have to recognize we're being asked to step up. The last thing I want to leave before we get to some questions from Jeremy for Ashley and I, we've been through this before.
Mhm.
So I've been, as you can tell, I've been in business for a long time. And so I bought my first house in the middle of the resolution trust issue at 18.5% issue interest. I started in 1989 at the beginning of a strong market that went to recession. I've been through the downturn in the Great Recession when we practically blew up the mortgage industry and broke the world economy. We've all been through COVID, being locked in our house and told that we weren't capable and weren't essential. And guess what we did in each and every one of those situations? We understood the problem, we analyzed the solution, we modified behavior, and we delivered. We can do this. Is it tough? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. On the other hand, consumers want our services and they value them, but we also have to help them understand them and value them more specifically. So that's my soapbox.
Thank you, Rick.
You bet. You
Great.
have
Well,
some
we'll get
questions
to
for
the
Jeremy?
Yeah, we'll get to some questions for Ashley and Rick. One thing I just want to mention, though, that's really important is that NAR did not agree in this settlement to accepting any liability. Okay, NAR did not agree with the plaintiff's claims or that they did anything wrong. This was a calculation based upon the costs and risks and time involved in litigation. The level of copycat lawsuits, the level of, as I mentioned, just the financial burden it would take to appeal. And so all of these things go into the factors to determine why someone would settle a lawsuit, but it has nothing to do with NAR agreeing with the basis of the claims or that NAR or any of the folks involved in any copycat lawsuit did anything improper. All right, so let's get to some questions, and then we will hop to the Q&A from the audience questions. So first thing, Rick and Ashley, I want to know from you two, do you think this is good for the industry? And why or why not?
Yes. Well, for all of the reasons that Rick just said, but I think that most importantly, this is such an incredibly noble profession, and we are dealing with some of the biggest assets of our client's life, right? There's no greater honor than to walk a buyer or seller through the process of listing and selling and buying a home, right? That is just a profound truth of what we do every day. But clearly, what our clients are asking of us is choice, clarity, and transparency. And really, this new era that we're entering into does all of those things on both the buyer side and the listing side. I personally am very excited about the opportunity to level up my skill set and my ability to communicate. And I love the idea of being a disruptor and sort of saying, how can I show up differently and speak more clearly to the value proposition that I've already built with my clients in my sphere, but do it better and communicate it more effectively. So I think it's a challenge, but I also love that about our community is that we rise to challenges every single day and we facilitate change, big change in people's lives. So I am very much of the opinion that while this is definitely a shift, as Rick says, this is a business practice adjustment. I think it's going to be a phenomenal opportunity for us to show up differently and for our consumers to hear that choice, clarity, and transparency that they are so clearly asking for.
So is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's a thing. And here's the way I want to say that prior to the settlement agreement, we had a lot of speculation about where the whole thing could go. Where was the money come from? What about the other lawsuits? What would the impact be? And to me, it's like showing a house next to a vacant field. And we all know that the buyer looks at that and they're so worried about the vacant field that they don't think about the main thing, the house. And at least where we are today is we have a clear sense of the shape of the settlement, the shape of the argument. So there have been questions about could it not be settled? If you look at some of the law, or could the settlement agreement not be allowed? And potentially, but remote in my sense, because if you look at the way the Department of Justice has weighed in on some of the other lawsuits, the Department of Justice certainly is being considered in this settlement agreement because they got a lot of what they were after. So is the amount okay? The two parties actually agreed to the amount. They agreed to what the settlement agreement there is. So a third party getting into the middle of this would be surprising. Can it happen on the accelerated time frame that's here? I think we have to wait and see, and only mean that we're not going to wait to begin to think about our changing practice, but rather some of the specifics are yet to be worked out. To me, I love the idea that I have a defined relationship, and I must have a defined relationship, whether it's on the sell side, whether it's on the buy side. I like knowing what my promises are. I like knowing what the promises from my client are so that we have a clear understanding of the job to be done, the expectations to be met. And so the fact that I now have to write all of this stuff down is a great idea because we've needed to do it for a long time. We've needed to do this since the 1990s when we began to see buyer representation as an expectation out of the courts and then out of our realtor associations and MLSs. The fact about what this will mean about agency relationship, I'll tell you, I think we're going to have to be able to understand it and disclose it better. But that's going to be state law by state law. NAR is not going to determine for each state what their agency relationship is. They're simply not going to. But what does that do for us as Oregon Realtors? It allows us to better understand and explain how we represent, whether a buyer or seller will be represented. And if we think about this, we've had one-sided relationships for a long time. An unrepresented seller, a for sale by owner. In the olden days, we'd go get a one-party listing. What we have today is a fee agreement, representation for a buyer, and an unrepresented seller. So turn the brim of your hat around for a minute and now say, now that's the buyer side. Could it be that you have sellers with unrepresented buyers? Yes, you could. Could it be that you have a fee for service with buyers? Yes, it could. Could it be that the seller continues to roll the fee into the transaction as they do today? Yes, they could. Could it be that the seller gives direct instruction to the listing broker on what the offer of compensation that can be made? Absolutely. So the issue about it is in a competitive environment, it allows entrepreneurs like you and me to have a variety of ways to do it with the proviso that it's done by written agreement. And there is nothing better for all of us than to have it clearly written, clearly agreed to, clearly negotiated. So I think in many ways it's a very good thing. It's certainly a challenging thing.
Jeremy, you're on mute.
Sorry, my dog was barking. Sorry. Thank you both for your responses on that. Look, Rick, you even mentioned, we had a training video we took down on the website, but we've been doing trainings on buyer broker agreements, on how to talk about commissions, we've been putting resources up on the website. We got a law passed in Oregon. We've been doing a lot in the last year. So what, if anything, is different now going forward with the settlement agreement?
Yeah, I can take
Yeah,
that.
you jump in, Ashley.
Jeremy, that's a really good question. I think for me and my brokers, what we're experiencing is the fallout of the news media, right? And the misrepresentation of facts that's coming through from social media platforms. I mean, every time I turn around, there's a TikTok that's talking about the settlement and what that means. And there's a giant misunderstanding from consumers, how we get paid and what the settlement means for them. I think everybody can kind of echo the sentiment that all of a sudden they don't have to pay their agent. So I think while we've been discussing buyer broker service agreements for a very long time, and we've provided education around how to utilize them and how to implement them in your business, the conversation for me, and I've been very close to this issue, as you all know, has sort of morphed a little bit differently. And that the narrative shift and the paradigm shift that we're kind of talking about here is re-educating our consumers at a much more profound level, because of the misinformation that's been spread around on social media and through, the New York Times or whatever news outlet people have. So for me, it's been a little bit more nuanced in that, hey, I'm still here to help you buy and sell real estate. So is my company. So are the brokers that work with me. We are here to serve you. We're here to help you get to the finish line of a purchase or sale, just like we always have. But let's talk about the semantics of what that looks like. And ultimately, it is your choice. Commission has and always will be negotiable. And every single business outline is different, right? What I do for my clients is going to be different than what Rick does. And that's the beautiful thing about this industry. And so we all have this unique opportunity in this season to really wrap that up in a way that makes a little bit more sense practically for our consumers to understand. So for me, I think that's been the biggest shift, is sort of like correcting the misinformation out there that all of a sudden brokers don't have to be paid, and that, they won't pay you, and they shouldn't pay you. And I'm sure Rick will offer a different viewpoint, but that's really been the last week since that settlement announcement has come out, been the biggest thing that I have felt the need to kind of correct and show up differently to articulate.
What's different? We're at a place at should versus must.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, we're not very good at should. We're much better at must. And so in some regards, the value of the legislation that we just passed for what was going to be January 1st, 2025 is a must.
Mm-hmm.
Now, interestingly, in the legislation, it says that there's a written agreement. It doesn't define whether it's going to be an agency relationship or a non-agency relationship. It simply says that you're going to have that written agreement. So that in the license law piece was on the should side, simply because if you know Mike Kozak in Central Oregon, he's been preaching buyer representation agreements since 1992. And the absorption rate of that has been woefully lacking. So now we're at a place where we must. And so the value of that is it gets us to the place where we now address the issue in a way that makes business sense, that makes a value proposition clearer, gets us to a relationship that's well defined. So some of the issues, reading some of the chat pieces, it's important for us, I think, to understand we continue to have the opportunity for differentiation. Ashley and I are different brokers in different parts of the state, right? But if I was in Ashley's market and she was in my market, we're going to compete vigorously. And we're going to compete on things like, what's the amount that we charge? What's the service that we bring for that? Am I a concierge? Am I a door key? We get to do all of those things. And the question that one of the questions came, won't it be less transparent? No, it will be fully transparent to each of our clients. Mm-hmm. So a listing client will know exactly as they do today. A buyer client will know exactly, as they have not known, but what we've been preaching here is you have to tell your boss how you get paid and how much it is. And are the options continuing to be open? I can go to a listing broker and ask for a greater offer of split, because listing brokers with seller permission will still be allowed to offer a compensation. But that is done listing by listing by listing, as opposed to a blanket. Okay. I can have the seller pay it as a cost for a buyer. And if you'll take an ABR class or an SRR class, you will see how that is done without it being called a concession, without it being limited by the amount of concession that's offered by lenders. And this is also an opportunity for lenders to get to step up and say, let's recognize what has been done forever, which is the cost of professional service, listing side and buying side, is now included in the transaction, as it has been, as appraisers have always known, and built into the system. So to me, it's those are some of the differentiation: clarity, contract, clear definition, clear requirement to negotiate, clear set of services.
Just really quickly, I think one other thing that it's highlighted is the desperate need for everyone to have a process and a standard of practice that they default to every single time. I think that oftentimes as brokers, we can sometimes just get bogged down by the minutia of what is our day-to-day activities. And it is so incredibly crucial that you have a system and a process for a buyer and a seller, and how you navigate through that. And those conversations are the same every single time. So if you don't have a process in place for your business, I would tell you that it is of the utmost importance that you build one, and that you follow it every time, which is all the more reason to lean into those classes that Rick is talking about.
And I want to just follow on what Ashley said, because part of the thing that does go away is a unilateral offer. That is, it's equal to everyone. And then you accept it by writing a contract. Now, Ashley's got to call me up. She's got to call Jeremy up. She's got to call one of our other brokers up and say, what do I get paid in this situation? And negotiate that. The requirement that it be consistent for you not the consistent amount. I don't mean that in any way, but a consistent process is because there's always a fair housing element in this as well. And we want to make sure that the proper disclosure, the proper negotiation of that also continues to meet fair housing law. So that's going to take us being better vetted in what exactly is required.
Rick, I want to pick up on something you said, because I think a lot of the questions in the chat are about this, and it's one of the most frequent questions we get is around the financing issues around the commission. Okay, and so I just want to spend a little time. I'll lay out a few of my thoughts and then let you both kind of jump in with that as well, because I think a lot of people are thinking about that. So if you think about it, right? For decades, cooperative compensation has come from the listing side, listing broker contributing to the buyer's broker compensation, and that has not counted against the interested party contribution limits from the loan, right? So we don't have a reason to believe why a cooperative offer of compensation coming from a listing agent to a buyer agent, the only difference being it was communicated in an avenue other than the MLS, we don't have any reason to believe that it would be different. Now, of course, until there's some clarity from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac about that, we shouldn't bag on anything. But, NAR did put out an email yesterday saying that they believe ultimately that is how things will be interpreted. There is language in the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac guidelines that say that costs that in the market have traditionally been paid by the listing side do not count as interested party contributions. And so, that would be consistent in this situation. But I think we still will have to wait and see. But we also know that the contribution can come directly from the seller in the sale agreement. As I mentioned, our sale agreement documents have been updated for the buyer to request that as a contribution to the buyer's closing costs. I think, as structured when coming directly from the seller, I've heard several lenders say, yeah, we're assuming that it's going to go towards interested party contributions. It will count against that limit. But I've heard some other lenders say that that's not how they're treating it. So I think this will all shake out and all settle out as we go forward. There's a lot of time between now and July. Once the court settlement is approved, I would hope that there'd be some more clarity from the financing agencies. But even in an environment now where at least some lenders are treating it as an interested party contribution, as Rick mentioned, if you take the ABR class, you can learn some strategies to address that as well. And Rick or Ashley, want to jump in?
So let's talk for just a minute about rolling things into a transaction as has been done. A seller has the right not to pay a buyer agent fee if they choose. A listing broker, thinking this through, listing broker is hired by the seller to market and advertise and get people to the table, and they are hired to bring buyers to the table. The other piece that they're hired to do is to activate all of the buyer agents in the market so the seller has the broadest access to all the potential buyers. Can sellers choose that differently? Of course they can. Your job then as a listing broker is to help them understand the impact of that decision. They have a right to it, but you also have an obligation to help them understand it. And as I like to say, if you go to a listing appointment, it's got a lousy roof and a pink front door and bad landscaping. Part of what you're saying to that seller as a listing broker is you better fix those things up so you have good curb appeal. Well, think about the offer of compensation or the ability to roll it into the transaction, bringing more buyers to the table. I think that's a piece of the discussion that you can have with sellers, because now we're not talking about a blanket way to do this. You're simply saying, how do we incentivize those issues? So on the lender side, whether it's a buyer paying it directly, if that's in a loan, the lenders will not finance that. They will not finance professional service fees as a separate line item. But they also won't buy appliances or tractors or a lot of personal property. So we know that those get rolled in. We know that those have value, as do the lenders, but they're rolled into the transaction. So it becomes a question about options there. So what sellers have done is say that with permission, here's how I will split if that's an offer of compensation. The real issue in that piece is it cannot use MLS as the vehicle to disclose in any way. In any way. So you can't have a back-ended database, you can't have a private database, you can't do it in any way, which means that transaction by transaction, it has to be there. Now, the other piece, it's a little piece that Jeremy touched on but didn't explore fully. Whatever the negotiated compensation you have with a buyer is the maximum you may earn. So let us say that the seller's offering 4 cows and a banana, and your listing is for a banana and 3 cows. That's all you're going to get, or your buyer agreement, you're going to get a banana and 3 cows, not 4, because you can't be incentivized beyond what your agreement with your buyer is. What does that say? Determine your value, demonstrate your value, negotiate your value, write your value down as an agreement between you and your buyer client.
One of my favorite points to just follow up with that, right? Like when Rick is talking about the semantics of that, it makes a lot of sense, right? The client doesn't have to do anything, but I think one of the pieces that are really crucial is to disclose, discuss, let your client decide, and document, right? And so how you do that is to just really firm it up and say you have the option to offer compensation to a buyer broker or not. But one of the quickest ways to eliminate a buyer's ability to purchase your home is to not consider paying closing costs and to not consider paying compensation should the buyer ask for it. I think sometimes we forget that this is a negotiation point, and it will be a negotiation point from here on out. So we have to be really clear on the buyer side to explain what that agreement is going to look like as far as your buyer broker compensation piece, but also to explain that you do have the right and the ability to navigate negotiations of those service fees through the contract with a written compensation agreement with your buyer. So, sellers certainly don't have to offer it. They certainly don't have to pay for it, just like they don't have to give the fridge or the washer and dryer as an inclusion or exclusion of the condition of their home. So we just need to get better about the idea that negotiation is going to be a key piece of our services moving forward, as it always has been. And the commission is just one more component of that negotiation if you're instructed to do so by your buyer side.
I want to touch on a couple of things that came in that I think are important to touch on. We have agreements every single day where one client pays for something that inures to the benefit of the other. The fact of who's paying the money versus who is represented by that person becomes a negotiated element. So if you think about it, you have a disclosure requirement today in Standard of Practice 1-13 in the Code of Ethics to say, as a buyer's agent, how I might be getting paid, and the fact that even though the compensation is coming from the listing side, I don't represent them in any way if that's the case. In 1-12, even though the seller is offering compensation to the buy side, they are not being represented by that person. So please stop the notion that because the money comes from one side or the other of the transaction, that does not imply who you're working for. That's why you have a defined contract, so that it's clear who you're working for.
So thanks, Rick and Ashley. And I want to dive in to get your strategies on effective conversations with your clients about buyer representation agreements. But first, I just wanted to close the loop. For all of you out there, what you're on the lending issue, your buyers should talk to their lenders, and your buyer can go to their lender and say, hey, if the listing agent is offering my buyer's agent compensation, how are you going to treat that? And is that treated as an interested party contribution? If the seller in the sale agreement offers it to pay as a closing cost to help pay, are you counting that as an interested party contribution? They can have that conversation with that particular lender and understand how that lender's underwriters are interpreting Fannie and Freddie rules and approaching the situation. That's what needs to happen. All right. Rick and Ashley, let's zero in on the buyer rep agreement piece. You both have a lot of experience and expertise in this. What are your best strategies, tricks, tools, suggestions for effective conversations with clients about buyer representation agreements?
There's a lot to unpack there, but Rick,
go for it. Well, first, let's say this is not about tips and tricks, right? This is about representation, professional representation of a client. So when you think about it, one of the important pieces is office by office by office. Okay, understand what your office policy is about representation. Understand what your office policy about which forms you will use, which forms of representation you are allowed to do. Office by office, that's totally appropriate, because while you're independent contractors, you have a contractual agreement with your brokerage, and that will include what kind of forms, what kind of relationships, how you'll do it. Okay. To me, in thinking this through, one question that was in the Q&A that I think is really important is, isn't this about us and our money as opposed to the buyer? And the short answer is, if you can't tell your value proposition from the position of why it benefits the buyer, take a step back, go work the problem. Because any value proposition is always in the eye of the receiver. It is not in the eye of the deliverer. So if you go out and say, here's the 93 things that I do, and here's how I have to split my fee with my office and pay for my overhead, you're going to lose. You are going to lose that argument, as opposed to, here is what I bring for the value offered. Here is how I can determine for you return on the investment you make. And the way I like to talk about this when I teach is learn to negotiate the net. And by that, I mean there's a gross cost, but let me show you how my involvement gets you a better price on the buy side, on the sell side, a higher price for you, a better value for buyers. I have to always do my value proposition from the eye of the client, not myself. And so it's really important for us because they won't sign the contract if you can't. They will not sign it if you can't. So that's my number one. Get a value proposition, and it should be unique to you. I mean, there's 1.5 million of us. That doesn't mean that there aren't 1.5 million unique individuals providing unique services as you as a broker, your company as a brokerage, you as your background, you as your past experience. All of that makes you a unique value proposition. That's what you've got to do to get that signed. And if you're not doing that, work it. And the last thing I'll say is tell your value proposition to other agents in your office because they know how to smell a rat. And if it doesn't play, if it isn't clear, if it doesn't sell value, those other agents in your office will help you. And they'll be brutally honest with you about what doesn't work and what isn't from that client's perspective.
Authenticity sells. You can't be somebody that you're not. And I truly think that this value proposition conversation that we're having today, it's unique to every single one of us. And while we functionally help people through the process, we all fill out contracts, we help people navigate this immense purchase. The reality is that what I bring to the table is different than what Rick brings to the table. And as soon as you kind of backtrack and go, okay, what services do I really provide my clients when they choose me? And what does it mean to work with Ashley Fordham? Or what does it mean to work with Rick Harris if they choose to hire you? That's a real honor and privilege that you got to sit with, and you got to get very, very clear about what that looks like so that you can convey it in a way that's respectful and about them. And it is always about them, right? There's a lot of power in going, I have the ability to educate my client. I have the ability to give them information and to allow them to make a decision. And then I get to enforce that line. That's a pretty powerful thing to be able to advocate for somebody fiercely. So don't discount that, but also don't rehearse it to a script where you're just sitting there from across the table and you're going, my value proposition is X, Y, and Z things. It's got to be authentic. It's got to be communicated clearly and passionately, and it's never about you. It's never about the commission. It's always about the level of service that you provide. And your clients should feel a sense of relief as soon as they come out of that initial consultation with you. And every time they meet, you're walking them through every single step with conviction and expertise and knowledge, and they feel safe with you. And they are able to make educated decisions based on facts, based on the education that you provided them. So you're going to have to sit with it is my best advice. And you're going to have to practice, and you're going to have to get very, very clear on what your elevator pitch is, because what's authentic to me is different than you. So don't be afraid to lean into that. Get a little vulnerable, figure out who you are as a person and if you were going to hire yourself, what is it that you bring to the table that you're excited to share with somebody? And the reality is they may not choose to hire you. You're not for everybody, and that is okay too. And I think more often than not, sometimes you walk away from those initial client interviews and you're like, well, I'm really thankful I didn't get that one because you know that they're not going to trust you or that it's not going to go well. And that's okay too. So, Rick?
It's quite interesting, Ashley, because statistically, when you look at it, people search for properties. 98% of people look for properties on the web. Okay. Mm-hmm. When they're ready to buy, 91% of them come and find a realtor. Why? Because they value professional service. So the question is for each of us, are we providing that when asked? Are we demonstrating it when asked? I love the notion of authenticity because you're right. Not everybody is for everybody. Some people feel totally comfortable buying a Yugo, and some people want to buy a Beamer. And you get to decide which of those you want to sell and in terms of service, and they get to decide which of those they want to buy. And that's the wonderful thing about the entrepreneurial business we're in, that it is the greatest thing about this country is that we get the opportunity to compete. We don't have to just be one way. And while there are constraints on that, we also get to work our way through it. We've been talking for a week about what's the workaround, what's the workaround. That is the heart and soul of who realtors are. How do I see the problem? How do I solve the problem? And for us, now we have to think about how do I change the dialogue so that I can solve the problem long term. There is not a silver bullet, but clearly there is a way forward. And we have to work together to get to that. And I don't mean uniformly. We have to get a clear understanding of how the problem is defined so that then we can, individual agents or within companies, solve it.
Great. Thank you both. I want to shift to the listing side and get your advice on, conversations with sellers on the listing side around navigating these conversations around cooperative compensation, both now and then. I know it's early, but thinking ahead to July at a point when cooperative compensation wouldn't even be offered on the MLS. What are your thoughts on effective conversations with sellers about the issue of cooperative compensation?
Ashley?
Well, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. I think the biggest thing is that you've got to educate your client on the state of where things are at now, right? Because inevitably somebody's probably heard something, and you need to understand what they know or what they understand to think is true. So for me, this is my set fee. This is the service that I provide. It's very, very insulary. And if you choose to hire me, this is what you can expect. This is what I'm asking for in compensation and professional service fees. And that's a very clear conversation. I'm going to help you control the narrative and the story and help you navigate through that process very effectively. On the opposite side of this, I think you need to break it out into two different conversations, right? There's the representation of what you're going to get when you choose to work with me, but also what, if anything, do you want to offer as compensation to the buyer side? Let's talk about that. Let's kind of untangle that a little bit and reverse engineer it. Because there's going to be no offer of compensation, there's obviously some semantics that we will need to work through as we begin to understand the rules once that settlement has been signed and agreed to by the courts. But I think practically it's a seller's choice. And if they choose not to offer any compensation, I don't think that we as an industry should push back. I don't think that we should be in a sense where it's like, you must do this or you should do this. It's, again, disclose, discuss, let your client decide, and document. And you can talk about all the semantics of a buyer side representation compensation, and you can educate them through that process, because inevitably that seller is probably going to use you to buy as well, right? And so you're going to have that conversation with them about, okay, here's the listing side, here's the buyer side. This is what it's going to look like when we go to purchase property. This is the buyer representation agreement. This is how I'll work for you on that opposite side, right? And how will that commission work as far as payment is concerned? So, there's a lot of semantics involved in that, but very simply, I think truly what it comes down to is making sure that your client understands the element that there are going to be some lending requirements that will maybe pertain the necessity to compensate a buyer broker, right? We've talked a lot about VA or Fannie and Freddie. There's some limitations on what can be paid or can't be paid. So I think it's really just educating them and very simply saying, these are the choices that you have. Here's what I want you to expect if you choose not to have a base of offer of compensation, and how we're going to have to navigate and negotiate through that.
Thank you. Listen carefully to what Ashley said there. Disclose, document, disclose, discuss, document. really important that you get to your specific process. So on the seller side, we have said for a long time, here's a fee. And this fee includes two parts. Now, we haven't always defined those two parts well, and now is the time to be doing that. That there is, here's what I do on your side in terms of negotiation, preparation, photos, advertising, activating, open houses, tours, etc. Okay. Now, you're also hiring me to sell your house. And just like you, I expect to be paid to work. And here's what that expectation is. And when I represent a buyer, here's what that looks like. And here are the kinds of things that I do. The issue that is slightly different is it will take written permission from your seller as opposed to disclosure from your seller on what the amount of the offer of compensation is. May I take a portion of that and offer it to the outside? And the seller has the absolute right to say no. They have that right. The question will become when you're disclosing and documenting and discussing, are you touching, as Ashley said, on what the implications for market may be? If you have a house if I work in a marketplace, take Mountain View, Idaho for a minute, there's a big Air Force base there, right? 70% of the sales in that market are VA. And in that marketplace, the market will react to how compensation is dealt with based on VA rules. That may work in our market, it may not work in our market, but understand that this is a market-driven conversation. So the other piece on the sell side here is that they then have to tell you if there's going to be a compensation, what it is. So some of the questions have been, can I offer a higher number? And if the buyer has a different number that's lower, can't I over incentivize? And the short answer is no. The seller can offer what they choose. If the buyer compensation agreement is less, that is the amount the buyer agent will receive. Whether that's done directly, whether that's done by rolling it into the transaction, whether that's offset by compensation that's in the transaction. Now, if I know that there might be a higher number as a buyer's agent, I may say to the buyer, I'll attempt to get that negotiated in as a different form of concession. I might be able to do that, but I, as an agent, can't make more because I've already agreed to what my wage is on the buy side. And so I think it's really important here that we understand this is not a one-sided conversation. Two consumers, two different sets of issues, two different disclosures about how it will work. But ultimately, it's all about that agreement between buyer and seller, willing buyer, willing seller. Now it is simply that compensation will also be one of those issues that is part of an overall transaction in terms of how we talk about it more fully. Gone are the days when here's the number, I split this, we're done. Now we have to talk about what buyers will bring to the table, what their expectations will be, so that a seller can make an informed choice. Nobody is dictating to a seller or a buyer what they must do. What we're giving them the opportunity to do is make a well-informed choice. And there are people who choose nothing. There are people today in the MLS who say, I choose zero. That's fine. That's allowed. It's part of the challenge when people say you don't negotiate. Short answer is, yes, we do every single day. The important part is, though, how are we documenting that effectively? And for your local association, for OR, for whoever provides forms to you, they are working through what those documents should look like. And the question is, can that be uniform? No, they can't be uniform. That is, there is no mandate that you must use this form, this MLS's listing form, that MLS's buyer form. No, you cannot do that. The only place where that happens is if you give your regulator the opportunity to write your forms. And we are not there. Thank goodness. What it does mean is for each of us, we have to be able to work our listing contract with a disclosure and discussion of money effectively. We have to do that the same on the buyer representation or buyer working with side of things.
Rick, wouldn't you say too that from your perspective, when you sit with a seller, they want their transaction to be successful, right? So if I have a buyer and I write you a very well-drafted offer with terms that my client is happy with, and you know that there's not a lot of errors in the contract. It's very well put together. It's very well drafted. There's something to be said for that too, when you're sitting across the table from your sellers and saying, hey, this buyer is requesting compensation. This is a very well-written offer. Let's discuss the terms. They're asking for compensation to be paid from your side of the proceeds. I think that the level of professionalism that's brought from the buyer side will communicate to the seller that, hey, this buyer is committed to purchasing this property if all of the terms of this agreement are met, but also their agent representation is just on point. I think that's another element that we as practitioners really need to consider, making sure everything is dialed in, making sure that the offer is very clean, that there's no missing pieces. We've all received those offers that you're like, what does that say? So, the elevation of professionalism will help communicate what I think we're trying to convey also. So that's a point I want to reiterate, that, it's all a negotiation, but also we need to consider the way that we draft those offers and the way that we communicate those offers for our buyer, picking up the phone and sending a detailed email and not just forwarding a DocuSign or a SkySlope package directly to you with no information. You had no heads up that it was coming. Those days are long gone.
I think the idea of differentiation, competition creates differentiation, and those who compete well shine. And those who don't compete well don't shine. And the harsh reality of it is we are being asked to step up our game. We're being asked on the buy side and the sell side. And our buyers have choices. Our sellers have choices. Does a seller have to offer compensation? No. Can you take a listing where a seller doesn't offer compensation? Of course you may. If I'm a buyer agent, does that mean I don't show them that? No, it means I learn how to negotiate the deal for the buyer so that they have access to the whole marketplace. Commercial transactions have been negotiating the fees, the representation, the obligation for payment each and every day right within the transaction. Mm-hmm. So for us, it isn't that real estate is going away. It is, however, that we have to learn a slightly different way to do this. And quite frankly, that piece of it, that piece of the negotiation, it's important to us because we wonder how we're going to get paid. But the bottom line about it is it's a small piece of the overall transaction. What they see, what they understand, how I provide them information, how I provide statistics on both sides of it, the fee, the amount of professional service cost is a small piece. It is an important piece, but it's not the only piece. And so it doesn't mean that we're changing every single thing that you do every day. We're changing one form of negotiation, one form of value proposition, and quite frankly, for all of us, we're changing the notion that we can get along without being as fully professional as we are capable of being.
Hey, thank you both so much. And I am going to come back to some questions to you, but we've got so many in the chat or in the Q&A that I do want to just get to some of those, and then we'll come back. We already talked about the financing issues related to seller contributions to buyer agent fees. So I don't want to talk about that, but quite a few questions came in on that. One question asked about, well, hey, if this is going to go in effect in July, why doesn't Oregon require MLSs to implement this stuff now? Oregon doesn't control MLSs. The state doesn't control the MLSs. The Oregon Realtors doesn't control any MLS. And of course, the individual MLSs in Oregon are going to want to see the actual language of the NAR rules that are developed. And so this will all come in time. But of course, nothing prevents you as an individual broker or your brokerage from making a decision to require the use of buyer representation agreements immediately to get started. And of course, that's what we've been encouraging folks to do and providing a lot of training on. So there was some questions about sort of like the larger brokerages that are above $2 billion in annual revenue. What does this mean for them? We're not going to get into the details of that here. If you go to that NAR, the facts.nar website, you will be able to read the full settlement agreement and get some more details on that. And of course, if you're involved in running one of those brokerages, you should directly be talking with NAR and with your attorneys about those details, but we don't want to get into those here. And that same thing for Home Services of America. They're a defendant in this lawsuit. They have individual issues that are actually up on appeal. They filed cert in the U.S. Supreme Court for issues related to their arbitration agreements, for example. They have their own set of facts and considerations to go through to determine whether they would want to settle in the future, but they're not part of this now. And of course, we can't speak for them. There's some questions about sort of the liability release generally, what it means for future lawsuits. So what'll happen here is if the settlement does get approved by the court, those cards will go out to people all over the U.S. You already saw some of those going out just related to the companies that did already settle previously in the Sitzer-Burnett suit. But those cards will go out. And anybody who is part of the settlement class, who doesn't opt out of that, they wouldn't be able to bring forward claims to against any of the released parties related to this issue of sellers arguing that cooperative compensation rules had harmed them and were an antitrust violation. Okay. So let's see. And Ashley and Rick, if there's any that you
One thing I did notice, oh, sorry, Rick. One thing I did notice in the question was, I think this is a really interesting take, and I think we should address it. It says, do we take down the BAC and MLS immediately, or is there a specified date? I know everybody's kind of wondering practically, what do we do right now?
Yeah, so again, the rule won't go into effect until the court approves the settlement and NAR actually drafts the rules. We're predicting July, but someone could object to the settlement. There's all sorts of things that could happen. In terms of individual MLS decisions about how they want to govern their MLS, that's up to them. And we're not going to comment that from Oregon Realtors, and we're not involved, have no control or influence over any individual MLSs.
There were a couple of things, questions about what I had said in the agreement with the buyer and how much you can earn. So whatever your buyer agreement says you can earn is the maximum that you can earn. So can a seller offer less than that? Yes, they can. Does that mean that the buyer can't negotiate the difference? Does not mean that. They can negotiate that. They can negotiate it with the listing brokerage prior to or in the transaction, as they can today. So there can be, if you're having compensation from more than one client, buyer client and seller client, you have to look carefully at the agreement in Article 7, which talks about disclosure of compensation from more than one client. So the important issue about whether the agreement says that buyers can earn more than what the offer of compensation is not what I said. What I said is they can't earn more than what the agreement with the buyer is. So that is really where the issue are. You're negotiating with your buyer about what you will get paid, and the idea of listing broker offering a bonus or offering extra on that side of it, that is not allowed under my understanding of the settlement agreement. Look at that carefully, and that will be laid out clearly in the rules, but that's clearly what the intent is, that buyers have a right to know whether it is a flat fee, a retainer, an hourly rate, or a percentage of gross sale price. Those are all ascertainable numbers. Could it be up to a certain amount? I think that's getting legally complex. I'm not quite sure there. But the other important thing that we always have to understand, that negotiations with your client always are negotiations. So if somebody offers slightly less, can you drop your fee some? Yes, you may. You have that right today. Can I make an adjustment to that by addendum? The perception is yes, I may, but it has to be in writing and has to be agreed to. Can I look at what the offer of compensation is and then jack it up in my buyer agent agreement because I heard I'm going to get more? I think you're going down the wrong road there. So understand your value, negotiate your value. Yes, these are different transactions than commercial. The intent, however, is to understand that in commercial transactions, broker to broker compensation and representation has been negotiated in contracts for a very long time. We on the residential side are not used to that, but it certainly is allowed. It is not prevented by the Code of Ethics. It is not prevented by contract law for that to be there. Now, you're doing that only with a written representation agreement on behalf of a buyer, because that is what you're negotiating, a term for your client, not for you separately, but for an obligation that your client has to pay within that contract.
The one thing I want to point out on some of that is that Oregon, is one of I think maybe a dozen states that has a law that says that you cannot share any portion of compensation or rebate any compensation to anyone who's not licensed. Oregon's law is written so broadly that that includes the client, right? So with this NAR rule, again, we'll see what the actual rule says, but with the settlement that says, you wouldn't be able to retain, for example, a cooperative compensation that's greater than what you agreed to in the listing or in the buyer representation agreement, then, it's not something under Oregon law that you'd be able to rebate to your buyer, but you wouldn't be able to accept it. Okay. So and I think we'll learn more as the NAR rules come out. And of course, we'll certainly provide additional guidance on that issue as well as things become more clear. Yep.
And Jeremy, forms are going to have to be adjusted. Yes. I mean,
yeah,
as you get a clearer sense, what you're looking at today and saying, well, this is how I know how to do that. Yes, it's going to adjust. It's going to adjust based on the constraints that the settlement agreement, as it is finally agreed to, put on us.
Right.
But understand that what NAR did not do is it did not say, no, a seller may not compensate a buyer's agent on behalf of a buyer through a transaction. It did not say that a seller may not offer compensation from the listing broker to the buyer broker. It preserved those pieces. It did it in such a way that it's clearly disclosed, clearly negotiated. And the other thing that it did is take away MLS as the vehicle for that disclosure. So it will be disclosed on a case-by-case basis. Their contention is that by a unilateral offer that tends to fix pricing, and so the way to not fix pricing is to make them individually negotiable, transaction to transaction, property to property.
Well, Rick and Ashley, we're coming up on 11:30, so I do want to go back to the two of you and ask you one question, which is, what do you think are the biggest barriers to success among this change? And really, what do you think will distinguish between the agents who thrive and those who struggle in navigating this change?
I'm going to start this one. Ashley's been doing a great set of programs called Mindset as your state president. It's about your mindset.
Yeah.
I've said this for years. If whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. But you can do this. So this notion that I can't is something you have to get out of your head. It's about your mindset. There are a couple of quotes I want to answer this with. So what Darwin said is, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent, the one most adaptable to change. And if we are willing to change, if we are willing to adapt, we will. And then one other person that I think you ought to go look for, his name's Brian Tracy, and he's got 3 enemies of success. And here's what they are. First, we're stuck in our comfort zone and we don't want to move our cheese. Second, we have learned helplessness. We have learned that somebody's going to do it for us, tell me what it is, and I don't have to think about it. And third, we take the path of least resistance. So combat each of those enemies, because if you're willing only to be compensated in the way that some third party thinks you should, you're not in control of your own life. If you can't get out of your comfort zone, how do you expect buyers and sellers in the largest transaction they're going to make in their life out of their comfort zone? How can they depend on you, who they look to for calm and order and understanding and process? And then lastly, don't turn over your future to somebody else. Don't do that. Those who don't create the future they want must endure the future they get.
Mm-hmm.
I believe we get the right to choose our future here. And quite frankly, what a great opportunity that is for us. Ashley?
One thing I love about this industry is that we, for the most part, wake up every single day unemployed, right? And we have to prove our value in order for our clients to continue to trust us and utilize our services. And one thing that I say to my agents all the time is that we have to have this intense grittiness to survive whatever comes our way. And I use this mantra of, you've got to have the rebound rate of a goldfish, which is 9 seconds. And you can feel whatever you need to feel in that moment. You can be angry, you can be sad, you can be all of the things. But after that 9 seconds is up, it's your job to get up, go after it. And every single opportunity to hear a no means you're just around the corner from a yes. And this business is tough. You are working incredibly hard, not only to advocate, but stay on top of your education, to ensure that your businesses are profitable, but also serve your clients to a level that is unprecedented. And you got to be gritty. You got to have the education to back up your practice. And you need to make sure that you're committed to the process of improvement every single day. This is an opportunity for you to show up differently, for you to communicate differently, and for you to just speak so clearly that nobody can misunderstand what you're trying to convey. And I don't want to diminish this moment in time for our industry, because there is a lot of noise. Every time I turn around TikTok and Instagram, some other agent has posted something about something, and it's exhausting. We've got a lot of noise coming at us on a daily basis, but do not misunderstand how incredibly profound this moment will be on defining your success in this industry and your longevity in this industry. So, wake up every day, be encouraged to seek mastery in your craft. Wake up every day to be committed to your process and to the betterment of your communication and your professionalism, and serve with your heart and be authentic, really is what it comes down to. So don't be discouraged. I know we're all just emotionally exhausted by what I would consider to be a whiplash, but I am very, very, very excited that this potential settlement has an opportunity for us all to heal and have a direction. And as Rick said, we know what's being built next door on the vacant lot. We have some clarity around what was a very confusing season for us all. So take what you've learned today. You have an option to lean into your fear, or you have an option to really adjust your practices and show up. So don't be discouraged. We're all in this together. We're all feeling it. But be excited by this moment in time, because I think that this is the moment where you get to shine and rise up and say, all right, I'm going to go get after it today, and I'm going to show my value, and I'm going to be the best that I can possibly be for my clients and for our industry and for those that I get to work alongside with every single day.
Well, Rick and Ashley, thank you so much for for all the wisdom that you've imparted today. And I want to tell the audience, we know there are some questions that we haven't been able to get to. We're about 5 minutes over what we had originally planned. I think the best thing for us to do is that we're going to save the questions that came in, and we will be updating our frequently asked questions documents that we have posted on a website. And we'll be doing more of these webinars. And so we'll be able to take these questions, make sure that they get answered one way or another. But so many of them have come in, I just don't feel like we're going to be able to go through one by one and get to all of them. Ashley and Rick, if there's anything in particular that you were waiting to comment on, feel free to do so. But otherwise, we'll save this, organize them by category, and develop some FAQ written responses and make sure that we hit those next time we do a webinar as well.
I'd only leave you with accredited buyer representation, seller representation specialist, real estate negotiation expert, pricing strategy advisor. 4 classes and trainings that I think help you tell the story better, demonstrate the value better, understand the compensation better, and deliver better service to your clients, seller, and buyer.
Lastly, I'll just say it's like my motto for the year, but adversity wakes up the genius.
Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for coming today. And remember those links that were dropped in the chat. Let me post them one more time. The facts.realtor, okay, is where you can get information, cut through what you're hearing in the media, get the facts about the details of the settlement directly from NAR. Competition.realtor, that's the website NAR has set up to provide you with tools for navigating buyer representation agreements, talking about your value, providing a wonderful set of tools that you can use. And OregonRealtors.org/BBA, that's our hub where we've provided tools, trainings, resources, forums, handouts that you can use related to commission conversations and buyer representation agreements. And I will drop those again in the chat. And thank you all so much for your time. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone on these important issues.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. As a reminder, we will have CE processed within the next 2 weeks. We will be sending out recordings, links to those recordings as soon as possible. We're aiming for Friday morning. And the links to all of the classes and resources that were referenced will get emailed out to attendees here shortly. And with that, thank you all and have a wonderful day.